Hello, folks. Welcome back to Mind Body Peak Performance with your host, Nick Urban. Today, I'm bringing to you a podcast on the science, the benefits, and use cases of full spectrum, naturally derived, organic grown hemp. And if you've tried a CBD product before and it just didn't work for you, I encourage you to suspend your disbelief for 1 minute, because our guest this week will break down the difference and why this should be classified as an essential nutrient, but only if it's done properly. Our guest is Will Kleidon. He's an award-winning pioneer and futurist in the hemp industry. He's the founder of Ojai Energetics, a company that's focused on providing the highest quality, most bioavailable, full-spectrum hemp possible. He's been featured in Rolling Stones, Cheddar, MSNBC, Forbes, Money, Entrepreneur, the LA Times, and much more. Will is a subject matter expert when it comes to the art, science, and technology of the hemp business, the history of hemp, and what it can mean for our future. Unfortunately, we did have some technical difficulties during the interview, so we had to salvage what we could, and a portion of the recording did get cut out. But nonetheless, I think that this one will be eye-opening for you. And having personally used their supplements now, I prefer them over my DIY approach and many of the alternatives I've tried. The show notes to this one will be at mindbodypeak.com/107. And if you're interested in trying one of the Ojai Energetics products for yourself, or to get a special discount that's not available elsewhere, click the link in the description below. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with Will Kleidon of Ojai Energetics. Will, welcome to Mind Body Peak Performance.
Thanks, Nick. Stoked to be here.
You don't know this, but I actually came across your brand many years back, and for some reason it slipped my mind. I didn't end up following up and trying out your product until recently. And I've tried a bunch of products in the full spectrum hemp space. Most of the time I'm disappointed, and this one was the rare exception, so much so that I wanted to have you on to discuss the science of hemp, the endocannabinoid system, and the different approach that you guys are taking. But before we get into that, what are the unusuals or non-negotiables you've done so far today for your health, your performance, and your bioharmony?
That's a great question. I love to run barefoot. I think that being barefoot there's a whole host of benefits that from grounding to walking in the dirt. It's what our ancestors have done forever. And non-negotiables. My diet's pretty strict when it comes to, like, I cannot have gluten or wheat. A2 dairy is okay, but A1 casein throws me off, and it's a fog and like a notable cognitive decline for about 3 days. So very strict with that, and limit alcohol. Ever since, like, looking at sleep numbers from like an Aura ring, I mean, even a drink, it's now saved for very rare special occasions. It's just not worth it.
I'm with you on all of that, including the barefoot. Are you going literally barefoot or with like the minimalist, possibly earthing soles?
I actually go full barefoot.
Nice.
But I'm unique with that.
Well, give us a stat or a controversial fact to foreshadow our episode on full spectrum hemp and what you guys create.
Well, I think that it may not be particularly lately inherently obvious from what we get in social media and media, but I do believe that the planet and our species as a whole is rapidly actually moving in a positive direction. There's obviously oscillations and waves, such as life, but overall, standard of living is going up everywhere. There's less war than ever before. But also, I think we're hitting an inflection point of entering a new epoch where we can have a much more healthy, symbiotic relationship together equitably as a species, as well as with all life on the planet. And there's multiple signals showing that. And part of the analogy is like if you start moving in the direction of health, oftentimes, and take if we take like a traditional Chinese medicine kind of frame, it's preferred when disease goes to the surface versus being hidden in the body. When it moves to the surface, it can be louder and more uncomfortable and more notable, so we pay more attention to it, and it seems like it's getting worse. But in reality, it's actually come, and it's not to say that you don't have to inherently pay attention and treat it with the respect and care, but it's much easier to deal with and have a gestalt by confronting things that are loud and present, and it's often a signal that we are actually getting healthier.
Yeah, a recent guest had this quote, and he said, "Acute illness detoxifies, and chronic illness, ooh,
Kills you.
I don't remember the exact quote now. It informs. Oh, that's what it is. It
Interesting.
informs. So it's like it helps you know where to focus your efforts.
100%. Yeah,
Mhm.
and then the acute is healthy stress dynamics, right?
Yes, if you're able to get through it and support your body through it, and then it can be healthy. But if you don't have the resilience to get through it, then you might want some extra support. And now my sloppy segue is one of those ways is to fortify your body and specifically your endocannabinoid system. So can you break down what that is and what hemp is? Because I think people are accustomed to hearing CBD, and that is useful, but it's only one small part of the pie. And for a while, I've been harping on not just CBD. Let's stop isolating and look at the bigger picture here.
100%. So first is what's the endocannabinoid system? Is that what you have? Yeah. So
Yep.
the ECS is effectively a master modulatory system of the body in that it has receptors in every single system of our body. So, from a systemic level, let's say digestive to cardiovascular, down even to a cellular level and even mitochondrial, you've got cannabinoid receptors. And it has receptors in literally every system of the body. And its primary function is to maintain overall homeostasis, not just for the system, but the entire human system as a whole. And so it's arguably the most important system in that it regulates homeostatic balance for the entire unit. And so you can think of it as like a conductor of the body's symphony of parts. And so when it's well tuned and firing and functioning, it enables overall optimization of all of our body systems. And so our bodies naturally produce cannabinoids endogenously. Two of the more well-known ones are called anandamide, named after the Sanskrit word for bliss of Ananda, and then 2-AG, which is less cool of a name. But those are the primary ones, and even now we're finding DHEA has endocannabinoid targeting activity, and there's likely way more, right? The system was discovered in 1991 by the godfather of cannabinoid science, Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, who just passed recently. But it's a relatively new system in terms of overall biology. And so we're just scratching the surface and understanding it. It's exceptionally complex in that it is able to have full-on modulatory effects in live time. So, for example, it can increase immunoresponse in certain areas and decrease it in other areas where most systems tend to be single directional. This can be playing in multiple directions at once in different areas. So very complex. And so we produce these cannabinoids internally, but then also our body's endocannabinoid system can be fed via phytocannabinoids or plant-based cannabinoids. And I liken it to our digestive system with our microflora produces B12. However, it does not produce anywhere near enough to have an optimal B12 nourishment of the body. We have to eat it, a source. And I consider phytocannabinoids to be really essential micronutrients to optimize our body's endocannabinoid system, particularly as modern humans. And so phytocannabinoids include CBD, which is what's really well known. And importantly, it makes sense. I consider it like the trumpet section. It's loud and it does a lot of lift. But our bodies have evolved for millennia, taking in a whole spectrum of these cannabinoid compounds and other compounds found in the cannabis plant or hemp, which includes CBDA, CBG, CBC. There's over 113 cannabinoids that we know of, and well over 400 complexes found in a hemp plant. And so, for optimal nourishment of the endocannabinoid system, you want to take the whole symphony orchestra, not just an isolated trumpet section. For what's called, and Dr. Mukulayam named it the entourage effect, where there's cascading interactions, many of which are unknown currently. But for example, a trace amount of delta 9 THC or other complexes of THC will agonize the CB1 receptors, which makes them more sensitive to then when the CBD, for example, lowers an enzyme called FAAH, which increases the body's half-life of anandamide and enables longer and more effective targeting of the CB1 receptors. And that's just one mechanism. There's many, many, many more. And so it's this cascading response of totality that is the optimal nourishment of our body's ECS. And so hemp is it's a legal definition. It is not a really botanical distinction. And so we arbitrarily set the limit to define what hemp is as any cannabis plant whose THC is below 0.3%. Nature doesn't care about that limit, but we have been able to select and breed strains to fit in the confines of that. And typically when you think of hemp, like you think of the fiber type, right? Like it looks like long bamboo stands, and that's not what's utilized for the highest concentration of modern CBD products. What they look like, you really couldn't distinguish it from a higher THC plant, which would not be legally hemp. And if you look back at, so humans have been working with this crop for thousands of years. In fact, it's one of the first plants we domesticated going out of hunter-gatherer into agronomic civilization. And when you look in Indo-Asia, it's recorded at the beginning of agronomic civilization as one of the primary crops of civilization in China as well as India. And so that was being grown for both. You'd have had higher THC varietals, but you also had the fiber types as well as the seed types. So the hemp seeds, which don't contain CBD, which is I think some people get confused on, the seed itself does not produce any cannabinoid. However, it's extremely nutritious. It's got a complete amino acid profile, which is pretty rare in a plant, as well as really good fatty acids. So we were using that for animal fodder, as any agronomic civilization does. If you grow a crop and you have leftover parts, in this case, if they're growing it for the seed, the leftover flowers and leaves would be fed to the chickens and to the cows and the goats and the pigs. And so that was done at the beginning, but then we know that it traveled through the Caucasus Mountains and made its way through the Nordic countries, but also went through the Silk Road. But then it also went from the Scythians, who brought it and brought it to the Greeks, who then in turn brought it to the Romans. And then anywhere Rome colonized, they brought cannabis and hemp as a primary crop into wherever they were colonizing. And then subsequently, the Europeans, anywhere that they went, they also brought it as a foundational crop. And in the United States, prior to the independence in the colony of Virginia, you would be fined if you were not growing hemp for the king. And our constitutional first draft was written on hemp. Our first flag was made out of hemp. And so you look back at each of these epochs, going from hunter-gatherer into agronomic, less evidence there's no direct evidence that we were using it as hunter-gatherers. However, there's a high likelihood, given that it shows up right away. And one of the ideas of what led to agronomic civilization beyond wheat for beer and alcohol, which is a high probability, but also would be the ability to fish and be in a stasis spot. And what technology was needed for that? It would be a net predominantly, and hemp fibers we know were used as nets right away in the recorded agronomic. So then you go from there, but then one of the unique profiles of hemp fiber type is that it's exceptionally strong. And so it enabled the etymology of canvas actually comes from cannabis. And so you look at the exploratory and deep sea stage of civilization, and that whole epoch of expansion, hemp was actually driving the technological enablement of that. And each time we go through these changes in going from hunter-gatherer to agronomics, the oxidative stress load skyrockets, and all the way through to this era, we've seen just an ever increasing oxidative stress load on the species. And funnily enough, the plant that enables a lot of these technologies, so right from fiber to nets to sails, and then go into the industrial revolution for lubrication for machinery and even fuel. The first diesel engine could run off of hemp seed fuel. Each time we went through these oxidative bump ups through epoch shift, the plant that was helping drive that simultaneously provided the micronutrient complex to feed our body's conductor or endocannabinoid system to buffer and handle that associated uptick in oxidative stress. And so one of the ways that the ECS maintains homeostasis is that when you have an oxidative event, it actually deploys cannabinoids to try and block it from even having any impact on the system. And if there is an impact on the system, it goes in and recalibrates it. So we've actually been living in the anomalous period as a species of prohibition. It's been ubiquitous for millennia. And we would primarily take our cannabinoids to feed the endocannabinoid system in a full spectrum format, not primarily through direct consumption, but actually through eating the animals and the animal products that were fed the hemp. And there was a study design done that got canceled because the company didn't want the data to go out, but I knew someone who was actually on the trial design side. And basically, hemp-fed chickens at 6% CBD content or CBDA content in the flour, which matches seed type hemp, would concentrate the CBDA in an egg up to 1%. So when you cook that egg, you're decarboxylating or changing the CBDA to CBD, and it comes out to about 240 milligrams of CBD per egg. And so our ancestors weren't just eating an egg a day, right? We were exposed to very high phytocannabinoid complex and CBD content through our diet, but then you also had direct consumption as well. So the oldest printed cookbook on the planet is a Roman cookbook that contains a recipe for taking the hemp flour, heating it, and they call it nard oil, which is spikenard oil, decarboxylating it, and then drinking it for the health benefits. And so we definitely had direct consumption of ingestion, but also combustion. The Scythians were known for and brought that where they went. So flash forward to Prohibition and us living in this anomalous period for the past 100 years, we also are dealing now with a massive oxidative stress uptick in the age of information and post-industrialization. And so we effectively cut out our phytocannabinoid nutrient diet intake and other direct consumption intake via Prohibition, and coupled that with way more oxidative stress. So we 1-2 punched ourselves from our endocannabinoid system's health standpoint. And so it's absolutely vital that we get to nourish our body's endocannabinoid system for overall homeostasis.
So you just hit like 10 birds with one stone. I was going to ask about supplementation and why that's necessary now, because I didn't think that our ancestors were smoking all that often or ingesting it. But I guess if you said one thing that's really important, that it's the animals, the livestock, they were consuming it. It was getting concentrated in the animal products that we consume. And then from there, humans were actually ingesting very significant quantities.
Absolutely. Yeah. It also, when you look at, so all vertebrates have endocannabinoid systems, but animals that grew up in proximity and evolved in proximity to humans respond very well and need lower amounts of cannabinoids than humans do. If dogs, for example, who would have been eating the scraps of the food that would have been fed the hemp And so they were getting their endocannabinoid system nourished with lower amounts. And if you look at humans and the meta-analysis of clinical data of what a minimal dosage amount for CBD is to really start to engage the system, we're talking at 250 milligrams being the lowest end, but the vast majority is around 500 milligrams as a baseline floor, and it goes way up from there. And so it's particularly from supplement side, most people have never taken anywhere near an effective dose to engage the system. But then you layer that in with the anthropological backdrop, it makes sense that our systems, which have evolved for millennia, eating one egg containing around 240 milligrams of CBD, it starts to make sense, the picture of why that dosage threshold is as high as it is for us and lower for the animals that were like dogs or the livestock who were getting more direct feed.
Yeah, I'm sure you're raising some eyebrows at this point because you said that most people have never experienced an appreciable amount of endocannabinoid system activation via consuming high quality hemp. And there's a lot of products out there. They've been incredibly hot over the last bunch of years. But I want to summarize what I took away. So humans have co-evolved alongside hemp or cannabis. Doesn't matter what the THC content is for this sake, but the fact is that it's usually had some level for the entourage effect. And then hemp is the best way to activate the endocannabinoid system. And what does it look like, since now we may have an under optimized endocannabinoid system? What does that look like? How does that express itself in terms of like something that I'm feeling or not feeling? What does it look like?
It's a great question. And yet, just a little clarification, the seed type hemps naturally have much lower amounts of THC than the types of cannabis that would innately have higher percentages. So that kind of explains why the optimal nourishment ratio is, you want a trace amount, but higher THC is a different story. There's use for it, but it's not as optimal in terms of ratios for overall homeostatic balance in the body.
Gotcha.
And so what does that look like? So it's a great question. Our bodies, right? If our ECS, its job is to maintain homeostatic regulation or balance for all of the different systems in our body. Each individual has a unique genetic profile and risk profile and environmental profile of what's going on, whether it be diet or exercise or otherwise, or other factors that puts different stress points on that individual's body. And so it can show up in many different ways depending on the individual. That being said, there's kind of the three major issues people or modern humans talk about is sleep, anxiety, let's say anxiousness before public speaking, if we're talking about supplements, and then pain. Let's say like from high intensity workouts, they're dealing with pain afterwards. Again, for the supplement side, those three issues all are exceptionally well addressed by nourishing the endocannabinoid system. And it goes way more from there in terms of overall homeostatic regulation. But those three tend to check the box. And again, you have to get a proper dosage for it to actually do anything other than placebo. And placebo is great. It just pales in comparison to effective dose. Those would be the top three ones. But it really, the reason that CBD is kind of like the Swiss Army knife of compounds is because it feeds the system whose job is to regulate every other system. And so it can show up in a very diverse amount of ways. And then we've actually figured out how to direct and tune. So you can think of the endocannabinoid system like it runs like a triage. And so it's monitoring every single system, and it knows which system is most in need of the cannabinoids, and it will prioritize that system, and it will go down the checklist, and including bone homeostasis, for example, which you're not necessarily going to feel, right? But let's say you've got something that you want to address that's nagging you, and your dosage, you take the optimal dose, and you don't notice an effect. For most people, particularly right with our patented delivery system, you can get it on the first dose, but if not, you can get it on the second dose, and it will be on. It's somewhat close to the checklist if we're thinking about it, but not. Sometimes it's not on the first set of triage list. So you can use these compounds called terpenes, which are the primary constituents of essential oils, but they're typically what make things smell. But they actually do a lot more than just olfactory sense. They are quite bioactive, and they're unique in that they can bypass limbic system, go straight in through olfactory, get into the hypothalamus, and start working, and they'll deploy from there. But they have a unique relationship with cannabinoids, and so they actually serve as like little tugboats to the cannabinoids and can change where they go in the body. And so you can use terpenes, but it has to be the right delivery system to enable this. You can, for example, if you take our formulation and you smell lavender right afterwards, the linalool, which is the primary terpene, there's a lot more, but linalool is the dominant one in lavender, will actually interact with the cannabinoids and push it towards calming effects. And so if your system's like, no, I'm working on your digestive system, and you're like, that's great, but I need to calm down right now, you can now bump it to the top of the list, but it won't do it in a way that throws you out of homeostasis, which again, we don't understand how the ECS knows how to do all this. It's exceptionally complex. But and typically where people experience the differences of terpenes and their relevance in cannabis is through the higher THC varietals, where people talk about, let's say, indica, which it's not the best system, but it works in terms of categorizing. Indica tends to be in the couch, is the more sedative, whereas sativas tend to be more energizing. And if you look at a chemical analysis of those complexes, of those different strains or varieties, the cannabinoids are virtually identical. It's the terpene profile, which is the variant. So myrcene tends to be more sedative, pinene tends to be more energizing, et cetera. But that only gets activated. They have to get into the bloodstream at the same time. And so combustion is the way to do that, and where people will notice these various effects and strains, even down to the nuance of, there's a strain called headband, for example, and one of its signatures is that it makes the user feel like there's a headband, a tingling headband effect. And so it's like terroir, but on a whole other level. But if you take it and you take it into an edible format, which is what's really important with how to get the proper dosage, for THC, the body transforms the THC into a compound called 11-hydroxydelta-9 after it goes through the first pass. And that compound is very, 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 very active at tiny amounts. And so it's where edibles can be, but it actually is much more of an agonist on CB1, and it lasts longer, which is, for some people, edibles, it lasts for hours, and some people like it, other people don't. But when it comes to CBD, for example, or any cannabinoid, and really any fat, our body has this water layer that's a buffer that prevents fat-soluble compounds from entering the bloodstream. So our mucosa membrane is effectively like the bouncer of the body. And when you eat something like a fat, because once the fat gets into the blood, it can travel anywhere in the body. So we have this innate gatekeeper that says, do I want this compound in my body? And so that process is if the body says yes, it will go through what's called first pass digestion. And at that stage, our bodies secrete bile, which then in turn nano-encapsulate the fat molecules, in this case cannabinoids, into these little bubbles of a water layer around it, at around 40 nanometers. And it's able to sneak past the water layer, and then it disperses out and goes into the body wherever it's going to go. This process is extremely inefficient for cannabinoids, and around 90% get destroyed when you eat them. So if you eat 100 milligrams, at best, you're getting 10 milligrams of CBD. And so, and the rest of it is completely destroyed. And then the terpenes are even less bioavailable than the cannabinoids. So when you're eating it with a regular way, you're not even getting any strange effects from that. The terpenes are even more degraded. And so the key is, can you get the terpenes into the system at the same time? And our technology enables that to be able to effectively bypass that first pass digestion, and we've figured out how to encapsulate them in around 40 nanometers, mimicking the body's process. And we figured out how to do it with only certified organic plants, which is really important for health reasons. So we basically pre-digested the formulas, so you can take it and it will get into the bloodstream very, very, very rapidly, and you can take way less and actually get an effective dose, which makes sense why when you opened and you said you tried a bunch of formulas and didn't feel anything, and then ours you actually feel, it's because you're actually able to get an effective dose, and it is quite pronounced, the difference.
Yeah, that's really important note. With so many different supplements and ingredients, they are not well absorbed, and sometimes that has other effects throughout the body, like turmeric, for example. If you use a low quality, poor bioavailability one, it does not have the systemic effects you're hoping for, but it has gut benefiting effects specifically. But at the same time, like, these products in general, supplements tend to be expensive. And for most of us, we want the systemic benefits. So that's why a lot of companies are using like absorption enhancing technologies like liposomes, like the one you were just mentioning, or colloids, or the phytosome form of different supplements. So it's interesting to hear exactly how that's working and how we're able to bypass that first pass metabolism that just essentially, I don't want to say wastes, because I'm sure it has some kind of biological effect, but like
That is a lot of waste.
greatly diminishes the power. Yeah.
The stomach acid does a number on the on a lot of bioactives. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And curcumin is a great analogy in that curcuminoids are almost identical to cannabinoids in terms of the pharmacokinetic profile, which is the fancy name for how our bodies absorb things, and bioavailability. They've got almost an identical molecular weight as cannabinoids, and they're both what's called class 4 compounds, which means they do not mix in water easily at all. They're lipophilic. They love fat, but they hate water. Um, and so for class 4 compounds, digestion is the most impactful. It's very poor bioavailability, and that's what cannabinoids are as well. They're almost the same size, and they're both class 4 compounds. And if you take a liposomal formulation of a curcuminoid, you get about an 8-fold improvement in PK profile. If you just decrease the particle size, you kind of sneak it in a little more easily. It still takes much longer to get systemic, and it's less pharmacokinetic enhancement. It's around a 3x. It's the same for cannabinoids, same for liposome. For cannabinoids, about an 8-fold. But then when you do a colloid for a curcuminoid, you get around 120-fold, so way higher improvement of PK. And that's what our technology covers liposomal. We can do it, but we actually focus on colloid because that is the closest to what the digestive system does in our body, and it's the optimal way for a class 4 compound for systemic bioavailability. Liposomal has what's called a fatty bilayer around and a water core, and so that was invented for compounds that, on the flip side, that are lipophobic but hydrophilic. They love water. They get into our bloodstream really easily, but then they're not allowed to travel in the body very well at all. And so the liposome was invented for complexes like vitamin C, which is water soluble to begin with, but that means it has a hard time getting into the cells. You want the fat to get in the cells. So what they do is that the vitamin C sits in the middle pocket of the water, and it's surrounded by this fatty bilayer, and it kind of Trojan horses the vitamin C into the cells. But for fat soluble compounds to begin with, if you take a liposome, it's going to put that compound in the fatty bilayer, and it's got a aqueous external environment, the blood, and then it's got a water shell. So there's that pressure. Basically, there's no incentive for the cannabinoid to ever leave the fat because it's happy in the fat. And so that's why it has a much lower bioavailability. It still has to break out of the fat, and it takes more energy to do that before and some of it gets lost systemically and flushed out. And that's where the onset time can be, if you're getting enough, which is key. You have to take enough to feel it. But if you do take enough, it tends to be about a 15 to 20 minute delay of feeling the responsiveness. Whereas with a colloid what we've perfected, most people can feel a response in under a minute. It's much faster because it's sitting there it's got a water shell and it's in the fat. And once it hits the environment, it breaks out of that shell and then it travels and does its thing. So so we do focus on the colloidal side.
We'll talk more about that because that was actually my initial response when I tried your product. I was surprised. I'm like, can I really be feeling it already? It hasn't even been 5 minutes and I'm already feeling something. And usually it's like 30, 45 minutes. I didn't know that was like a common response. So we'll get to that in a minute. But when hemp it enters the body and it docks to, you mentioned CB receptors. Are there just two of them? And how does THC work on those receptors, if at all?
So there's two receptors that are well known, and CB1 is one of them, and the other one's CB2. CB1 tends to be more expressed in the nervous system, including our brain, and CB2 tends to be more expressed in peripheral systems like the gut, digestive, immuno systems, plural, because there's more than one immune system, right? It's complex. But so THC directly binds to the receptor called CB1. And when it binds to that receptor, it does so because it's molecularly very similar to our body's endogenous cannabinoid called anandamide. And anandamides, one of the functions it does in the brain is it's tuning and maintaining overall homeostatic tone and balance. And so it's ensuring that all of the complexities of our neural networks and overall system is firing and harmonizing. And it's unique in that the cannabinoids are postsynaptically synthesized. So they actually can have these retrograde effects in lifetime and change all these different things, which is unique. So with its uniqueness of having, one of the ways that it can do its modulatory nature is that it's postsynaptically synthesized. And so the endocannabinoid system is kind of like an adaptogen, but as a system, right? It's so like an adaptogen is a modulatory complex, whereas most compounds are single directional. They're going to turn something up or they're going to turn something down. And same for most systems, but the ECS can turn things up and turn things down and selectively do it. So it's very dynamic. So anyways, the THC mimics anandamide and it binds to CB1, but our bodies produce anandamide in various always, but in different scenarios it can turn it up, and but it tends to do it quite locally in certain regions of the brain. THC floods all the receptors at once, and so you can think of it as like anandamide being like a highly specific jazz song, whereas THC is like someone dropping the bass in drum and bass. It's loud and it's everywhere and it's fully encompassing. So that's part of how THC impacts us and why people like it is, and there are therapeutic uses for sure, but I liken it to more like a scalpel. It's less. It's for from a therapeutic perspective, it's less adaptogenic and more just on. So it's less modulatory in nature. And then from the adult use perspective, it's turning that system all on at once, and so that's what creates these euphoric, and again, anandamide being the compound named after bliss. When you get anandamide, you feel blissful. It's how we're innately tuned. But it is much louder, and so that's part of where you see some of these issues that are. THC is perfectly safe in regards to most compounds. In fact, like what's called LD50, which is lethal dose of 50%, dying at that dose range. The LD50 for water is higher than, THC is lower than water. So you would die from overhydration before you got sick from THC or any cannabinoid. It's exceptionally safe, but it still can have downstream negative effects in certain areas. For example, like short-term memory recall, and that is because the endocannabinoid systems modulates memory formation and balancing. And so if you've got it going from a finely tuned jazz to a heavy loud bass show, it can throw off the homeostatic balance of the brain, because it's basically fitting in the receptor where the anandamide would be targeting, and it's blocking the anandamide from being able to target, which is why for people who are using cannabis and higher THC, it's essential that they take high CBD that's at a high enough, obviously enough to be effective, where it actually counterbalances it. So if they use it in the morning, the higher CBD, it will actually increase anandamide half-life, recalibrate the brain, and get rid of a lot of the issues that they're thinking of that tends to be associated with just high THC usage. So that's THC binding to CB1, and it probably is interacting with other receptors that we're not aware of. THC does bind to 5-HT2A as well, and 5-HT, which is a serotonin receptor. And so the 5-HT2A receptor is known as like the psychedelic receptor. And so that's why high THC cannabis, can be both psychedelic, and it's the quote unquote stoned effect is just the heavy blasting of CB1. 5-HT2A is another receptor that we know THC binds to. And there's probably more. And then we've got CB2, which 2AG targets more. 2AG also targets CB1. And then CBD does not actually, it does have what's called a negative allosteric effect, which basically means you've got the main binding site, and then there's another docking site, and it can go in and change and basically close off the main docking site of CB1, so it can shut down activity at CB1, but it does so selectively. And it can agonize CB2, but not particularly strongly. But it does target very strongly the TRVP1 receptors, or the vanilloid receptors, or capsicum receptors. And those receptors regulate temperature as well as pain. But when you bind to the TRVP1, it actually increases anandamide production. So, which then in turn goes and targets CB1 directly and tunes things for homeostasis. So there's a lot of cascading downstream effects of how it works, and it also not on a receptor site, but what it does is it modulates selectively again, which we don't know how it does, FAAH, which is the enzyme that destroys anandamide. And so when we're dealing with an oxidative stress event, our bodies will produce anandamide, because all cannabinoids are very strong antioxidants. An oxidative event, you can think of it as like rust for the cells. It's right, and so it goes in and tries to buffer it from even doing anything inside the body. But when we're dealing with an oxidative event, our bodies actually uptick FAAH production, which in turn destroys the anandamide. And so when we don't have a properly nourished endocannabinoid system and cannabidiol or CBD presence with the other cannabinoids, you're not getting that modulation like you do with CBD of FAAH. So the body can get stuck in an endocannabinoid deficiency, where it's a negative feedback loop. So it burns up the anandamide, gets destroyed, and then the FAAH destroys it. Whereas if you've got a sufficiently tuned endocannabinoid system, it modulates the FAAH, and it enables that anandamide to keep circulating, and it tunes it in the proper ratio. So that's some of the systems of CB1, CB2. We discovered CB3. There's going to be more, because the system is so complex and we don't know what it is yet.
Two questions for you on high THC or normal THC cannabis. First of all, what is the effect on mitochondria and free radical production? And then also, can you think of a reason why frequent cannabis users, would prefer not using CBD?
Yes.
Or hemp in general?
So I do not know directly on the mitochondria and free radical, although the that's a great question to dig in, but I need to research that. But cannabidiol does target mitochondria and enhances mitochondrial health and function. You've got CB1 and CB2. I think you've got CB1 and CB2 expressed at mitochondria. So that means that if we do have CB1 at mitochondria, which I believe we do, I need to be sure of that. But then the THC would be binding to that CB1 receptor and then blocking the anandamide from being able to target it and enabling homeostatic regulation of that mitochondria. And so that's one way that it could create a dysbiosis by basically over-agonizing and blocking the tuning effect of the anandamide. And we do know that the cannabidiol protects mitochondria and actually optimizes mitochondrial homeostasis. So there's that. And then why do high THC users, why would they not like CBD? It's a great question. One piece is that if you take it concurrently, the cannabidiol, because it's negative allosteric modulation effect, it's not just, it's a negative allosteric modulator, and it's limited at CB1. It's not particularly strong, but it will blunt the euphoria and some of that activity and the quote unquote stoned effect of the THC. But it is actually, it's not a direct negative allosteric modulator on 5-HT2A, but it's a downstream negative allosteric modulator where it will change a glutamate level, which then in turn tripwires another process that then goes in and binds allosterically and has a negative effect on the 5-HT2A, which shuts off very strongly the psychedelic effect. And so it's a much more blunt, pun not intended, blunted effect of the THC for the user. So it would make it way less pronounced, depending on the levels of its presence in at the same time. But there's no reason why having a cycling effect of taking high THC, if they like that, and then using a high CBD in the morning, unless they want to use it in the morning, which some do. But having a cycle with it, there's no reason why they wouldn't want it, because another thing that it does is that, so one, it helps mitigate any of the memory side issues of THC, which has been decently studied. And one of the mechanisms is likely through the anandamide increase to recalibrate the brain afterwards. But then additionally, by having the anandamide targeting and recalibration, it actually can lower tolerance of THC. And so if you preload with high CBD, you actually need less THC to get as strong as an effect. So it actually helps the user in terms of not what THC does, build tolerance very, very rapidly for most people. And so this can actually have financial benefit as well as consumption benefit by recalibrating that tolerance level back down by doing a proper cycling. But again, you have to take enough CBD for it to work.
One thing I've noticed, if I ever have too much THC somehow, especially, I don't know if this works with edibles too, but using CBD to offset THC is a godsend. It is really helpful because I personally like the effects of CBD and the other cannabinoids a lot more. They feel more grounded and less intense. So that's a great way to take the edge off. Does it work with edibles as well?
It does. You just need typically a higher amount because the agonization on the CB1 is the 11-hydroxy delta 9 is like notably more potent. So you just need higher amounts to boost more anandamide. So, and it definitely helps with edible. And then for you, so basically there's a subset of the population, about a third, where THC can be way more psychoactive than the average bear's response. So some people find it very relaxing and never have these intense paranoias or anxiety or trippy experiences. But then a third, it's stronger than like well-known, typical psychedelics in many cases in terms of tolerability. And is that your experience with?
Yeah, I experience it very intensely.
Yes, so I do too, and so we have a higher expression. One of the likely um, factors is that we have a higher expression of 5-HT2A receptors, and there's also some GABA interaction, but where it's much more intense in psychedelic. And so there's a hack that works really, really well for people. Some people say, "Oh, I just can't have THC," and because of that. And what is a hack that works is for many is that if you smell the cannabis, since this won't work for an edible, um, but if you smell it and it smells delicious, and there's like you'll feel kind of a tingling sensation in the olfactory bulb, um, that terpene profile matches your body's homeostatic imprint for that moment. And you still want to take less, but the dysphoric effects don't happen unless you take. If you take too much, you take too much. But but if what's fascinating is that one strain may smell delicious and have that tingle that day, and then the next day it may smell awful. But if you smell it and it smells awful, you're pretty much guaranteed for an unpleasant ride. Um, and so the nose actually knows what's right for our bodies when it comes to how the terpenes, right, which are like the little tugboats, where they're tuning the THC in the body. And it's a pretty good hack. It works for most people who've tried it, who are of that subset who just can't, who are way more sensitive to THC.
Yeah, that's really cool. I had no idea. And I always just thought that the majority of the language behind different strains was just marketing material and a different smell. And I figured that smell came from somewhere. But it's cool to hear how different the terpene profiles can influence our tolerability and desire to use one strain versus another.
Yeah, yeah, and the terpenes they work like those tugboats, agnostic to the cannabinoids. So it's the same for CBD. And so what's unique with cannabis? Cannabis does not produce any unique terpene, but it is one of the most diverse terpene producing variants of all plants. So some plants can smell like an orange grove, and another could smell like a diesel engine, and the other one could smell like a pine forest. Each of these unique terpenes, and then some other compounds, but it's a very, very, very different terpene production, and that's what, if you're combusting it, will drive those effects in the user. But it's not just the terpenes. It's like it's pretty profoundly complex, and how it layers the levels of terpenes. So, for example, because our delivery system enables you to get the cannabinoids pretty much immediately into the bloodstream, the you can take the, as I mentioned earlier, you can take the elixir, get an optimal dose, and then smell an orange. Now the limonene, and when you're inhaling the orange, you're pulling these terpenes, which are like they're fat soluble, and they're slightly denser than gas, but they're tiny, and so you can pull them up, and they'll cross in through olfactory, in cross blood brain, go to hypothalamus, and deploy out. Limonene tends to focus around dopamine systems as well as digestive systems. So if you take the elixir, you smell an orange, you're going to feel more of that euphoric side, even if it's just CBD, than, for example, if you smelt lemongrass, which is dominant, and it does have some of the limonene, but it also has primarily myrcene, which is sedative in effect. And so you can play with it with just herbs or essential oils. If you take, for example, peppermint, and you smell it, the menthol targets more the cannabinoids more towards the adenosine receptors, which are like caffeine receptors, and so you'll get this alert response in terms of how the cannabinoids are targeting. And if you smell the myrcene, you'll feel sleepy. And you can change gears on the spot, which is unique with our TAC. But then if you take the terpene profile of a myrcene dominant strain and you do the same thing and you smell it, actually smell the nug, for example, with the elixir, you're going to all of a sudden start to experience a full-on nuance of what that strain is like for THC, but a CBD version. So, for example, if you smell headband terpenes right after taking the elixir, you will even get the headband effect of, but not with THC, which is, it's fascinating because it's the same terpene inputs, but these different ratios of the other terpenes unlocks an entire nuance that's very unique to cannabis, and it feels cannabis-like, but it's not THC. We've got some cool collaborations with that type of technology going to be coming out in beverages in the near future.
That is so cool,
Yeah,
and
it's so wild,
mind-bogglingly
right?
complex at the
Yeah,
same time. Like, how can that all be happening?
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
And also studying that would be incredibly difficult.
it is because it's live time, right? And we're talking about, unless you're like doing neurochemicals are inherently hard to and complexes that work in those areas because they're moving in the body unless you've done like a really invasive procedure on a human to be able to test where it's going. Now what we could do though is we could which I'd love to do actually is uh, now there's I would I have health concerns with it because cannabinoids when you start you could put a radioisotope dye and connect it, right, and you can start to see where it's going, and you can see how it's changing with different terpenes present. That would be one way to do it without an invasive procedure. But my concern is that when we start tweaking cannabinoids and from their natural forms, really nasty things start to happen. And so spice is an example, right? People can get heart attacks from spice. You're seeing this flood of these synthetic
Spice being a synthetic
cannabinoid.
cannabinoid.
Yep. And so when you start playing with the system, who is highly complex, and its primary purpose is homeostasis, which is staying healthy and alive, you can start to see these really weird downstream effects. And so that's where in the pharmaceutical space, there was a company that stopped their clinical trials of their synthetic cannabinoid because, and I believe it was in phase 3, which is far along. 7 people died, which was catastrophic. And so we've seen it with like you've seen like there's instances of spice zombies or called potpourri, but people can have like strokes, heart attacks. When you start throwing that system off, it's very dangerous. So you got to be really, 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 really careful, not with anything that is not found that humans have evolved with for millennia, including right. There's a big fad and popularity, and it doesn't mean that they're inherently wrong. It just means that the risks are very, very high. And needs to be the safety profiles need to be studied properly. There's a flood of these synthetic cannabinoids on the market that have not been studied and they've not been tested. And some of them you do find in the plant, but albeit at very low concentrations. So that's something that again warrants safety profile studying. But cannabinoids in general, if they are phyto derived, meaning plant derived, and not modified or synthesized or changed through strong acids or anything, but like actually the compound produced in the plant has an incredible safety profile. But what we're finding is these delta 8, for example, it's produced in cannabis, but at tiny levels. So the delta 8 products that are on the market, those are not from plants. It would be like $35 million a kilo for the amount that the plant actually produces. No one's making phyto delta 8. What they're doing is they're taking a cannabinoid and they're processing it through very, very heavy acids and changing it. So it's using it as a building block and turning it into the delta 8. But cannabinoids have these things called, you've got left-handed and right-handed ligands forms, and then you actually have up and down. So it's quite complex. And the famous case of ligand difference is molecularly they look the same, but they're like you put a mirror, and in this case you put a mirror between and up and down, right? It's the structure. For many complexes, the ligands, some are active and other ones aren't active. But in some cases, like I think it's Talmalide. It was the horrific drug that was given to pregnant mothers that caused the birth defects. And so the left-handed one, I believe, was the one that caused the birth defects. The right-handed one was meant to be safe. But what they didn't realize is that when you eat the right-handed one, so they isolated it and only gave the right-handed one, the body's first pass digestion actually metabolizes the left-handed one. And so that's where it's like severe effects. Now, when you're synthesizing these compounds, you're creating a totally different ratio of up, left, up, right, down, right ratios that you never see in nature. And also the other concern I have, so that just needs to be tested. It could be perfectly inert and not have any issues, but again, it needs to be studied and properly studied. And I don't think people should be guinea pigs for that unwillingly. And then the other issue is that these complexes are, when they're making these formulas, there's unknown synthetic cannabinoids that are produced, and they have no idea what they are. We have no idea what they're doing in the body. And then what's particularly concerning is that I know a lab that's an ISO lab that we use. So ISO being top standard for, regulations, that different batches from different producers claiming Delta 8 had totally different unknown synthetic cannabinoid profiles. So how the chemist is making it. So I strongly, I don't recommend that. I think we're playing with fire there. And we just need, and it could be that it's perfectly safe, but we just need to get.
It always warns caution when we're tweaking something that we know very little about. Like in the grand scheme of things, we're still discovering new cannabinoids and tons of active compounds within it, let alone how they work, how they stack, how they combine. So thinking that we can just go and tweak this and that and have this exact outcome is fairly arrogant, and I hope it pans out for the best. And one thing that I keep coming back to as you describe the endocannabinoid system, and this may or may not be a good analogy, but I see it as like the central processing unit, the CPU of a computer. And by upgrading it, by giving it everything it needs, it's like getting a new computer. It makes all of the functions easier, more fluid, faster.
That's a brilliant analogy. 100%. And that's.
And then if you are adding the wrong things, you're taking a molecule, you're tweaking it, it may impact the way that CPU is working. It might overwrite what's called the kernel, and that could work great. You could find a new breakthrough, but also more likely, you're going to have all kinds of downstream consequences, and it could be in virtually any organ system throughout the body.
You nailed it. And like 100%, that's a beautiful analogy. And the ECS is regulating like literally every system, including our respiratory system, our cardiovascular system, right? Like, so you start throwing that out of into dysbiosis, really bad things can occur. And as you said, it can be a downstream effect, right? Like it's such a complex web of highly tuned nuance of retrograde signaling and all of these phenomena of balancing acts. You don't want to mess with the conductor or the GPU lightly at all.
All right. Well, you've sufficiently scared me away from some of these synthetic alternatives that are cropping up and becoming fairly popular. But one thing that you mentioned also earlier is the effect that these different compounds have on people can vary tremendously. Like you and me, for example, don't do as well with THC as some people do. Are there any particular genetic SNPs or other things that would explain the dramatic biochemical individuality of this?
Yeah, it's yet to be really well understood, right? We're early days of pharmacogenomics. It's going to be fascinating. I think it's the future of medicine, right? Like it's going to make tremendous leaps and bounds for all sorts of areas. One is known is how people, and I don't know the actual name of the sequence, but basically there's variants in our FAAH production. So there's one lady who's known as the Wolverine lady. She does not produce FAAH. And so if she gets a cut, she heals extremely fast. So she just has a huge amount of anandamide circulating that doesn't get degraded. And so she's also constantly in a blissful state, very, very happy, and seemingly good. The downsides is her pain threshold is really, 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 really high. So noticing, for example, hot stoves is an issue. But then on the flip side, she heals really fast. Um, that's extreme, right? And then, but from there, we've got different levels of FAAH production. So that's one known that's like well understood of how an individual is going to have a different response. And so there are certain individuals that need way less phytocannabinoids. They still need it, but to get it an engaged endocannabinoid system, and they're going to have a more tempered down FAAH expression in the body, most likely.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different avenues we can explore now, but we've already been going for an hour and 5 minutes. So I want to be respectful of your time. Hopefully, we can come back and do a round two and talk more about optimizing your protocol and things you can stack and combine. You've already surprised me with one that I've never heard of, and that's combining terpenes with the right products such as Ojai Organics. We haven't even talked about your background at all, but with our remaining time, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the difference between your product and some of the others, because a lot of the ones out there just don't deliver what they claim to. And I will weigh with my experience towards the very end also.
Awesome. Yeah. So yeah, we pioneered. We figured out how to do encapsulation of cannabinoids back in 2014. One of the first companies actually in the sector. We're the first public benefit corporation in the space, and took an approach of really diving into the science and the safety. And so we led the industry and set the standards, which we're seeing more of, but I want to see even more of doing third-party batch testing. I'd like trust but verify as a philosophy, and so we have the third-party ISO lab. We test not just for cannabinoid content and terpene content, but also volatile organic compounds, pesticides, herbicides, heavy metals, and microbes per batch. And so you can take your lot number and see exactly what's in your product every single time. And we've led the way with that, and more people are. They're not doing as robust as I'd like to see, but it is getting more of an industry standard, which is great. And really the foundation of cracking the code when it comes to bioavailability with cannabinoids, and doing it in a manner that is not just certified organic, which is good for the planet with the right practices, but also for you and the individual body. The higher the dose on the dosage range of the bell curves, if you go to a higher bell curve or higher sweet spot, it's not going to affect something that was prioritized in a lower dosage amount greater. It just means that it's going to be able to tackle more systems at once. So each higher dosage range point just means it's a more breadth of overall systemic targeting. But if it's on the list, it's going to make sure that it's tuning it exactly to the level of homeostasis that it wants it to at if you get it on the first sweet spot. So more does not mean more in terms of volume, for example. But it does. There are certain situations of particular scenarios in the body where a higher dose is going to be needed to tackle to even get to that first bell curve. So in certain individuals in certain scenarios, and also for more like acute situations, a higher dose range it's going to take longer to get sweet. And so there are kind of averages where if people don't want to play with like the honey dosing method, like most people, you're loading. So you think of like we've artificially idled our endocannabinoid system right through the prohibition and artificial phytocannabinoid blocking. So it's like an engine that needs to be turned on again. And so you got to prime the pump. So you need a loading dose to really kick the system into gear. So the first dosage tends to be a little higher. Most people need 2 droppers to be there is when they'll notice it starts to turn sweet for their first time. And then it can be under a dropper to a dropper for really healthy people, or if they've got a more efficient endocannabinoid system, and then some 3 a day. Most like normal encounter scenarios that our bodies are going to want, 3 is sufficient. And then some scenarios people may need to, the highest I've ever seen is up to 6. And that's in like pretty heavy duty lift mode, or acute scenarios. But you'll notice that you're if you don't want to use the honey dosage method, you can just stick to 2 or 3 a day, and people can put it in coffee or tea or juice, and it's going to be less optimal and less tuned, but the laws of averages, you're going to hit those sweet spots over time. So if you don't want to do it that way, you can take it in a more blind manner and still definitely reap the benefits.
Yeah, I like to just do it once per night right before I go to sleep, but on my to-do list is experimenting with it in coffee and at other times during the day. So that will be another experiment. But due to some technical difficulties we had today, we will skip the rapid fire round and we'll save that for next time. And I will ask you one question that I'm very curious about, and that is, if there was a burning of the books and all knowledge on earth is lost, but you get to save the works of 3 teachers, who would you choose and why?
It's a really great question. So one, I'd pick Buckminster Fuller. I think he's a systems architect, and his work on beyond like if you look at the dome at Disneyland, that's a Buckminster Fuller design. And there's like carbon 60 molecules, they're called buckyballs, named in his honor. He's a fascinating individual, but he's, I think, one of the most brilliant minds of our modern times in terms of looking at system sciences and holistic system sciences on how to navigate life on Earth in a manner that is bioharmonic and done with proper systems level thinking. Um, so his works. He's got a great book called Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, and he like invents words too. So some of the stuff it's like doesn't register, but it's overall thinking, I think is just incredibly valuable.
Bonus points for using the word bioharmonious. And then also, interestingly enough, I actually recorded a podcast on C60 earlier today.
Yeah. Did you really? Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
And so he talked a lot about synchronicities. Um, I was actually like in the bar where there's always fascinating characters, and I said something about a synchronicity, and the gentleman next to me was like, "Oh, that sounds like my good friend Buckminster Fuller." I went, "No way! You knew?" I said, "You knew Buckminster Fuller?" And he goes, "He was one of my thesis professors. This guy was like one of the heads of neurology at Stanford University." Anyways, so there's synchronicities around Bucky. It's awesome. Um, not a so the field. It's like, I don't know if it's cheating, but basically like an integrative medicine summary of textbook. I would want us to maintain knowledge of both. Like Western medicine is absolutely wonderful if we're dealing with acute traumatic injuries, right? There's no other medicine I'd want, but I'd want it integrated. But if you get hit by a bus, it's the best, right? Like, however, allopathic medicine is horrendous when it comes to preventative care and holistically minded, and our body is not an individual system. It is a complex symphony of parts in RECS, right? It modulates all of it and harmonizes it. But having integrative medicine, understandings of Eastern, like Ayurveda or traditional Chinese medicine, right, that have you look at TCM and Ayurveda have had robust, healthy populations for millennia, right? So having a integrative consortium of medical understandings that encapsulates all the best, I think is great would be vital. Did you ask for 3?
2's fine. We
Yeah,
can
okay,
end there
great.
too.
Yeah,
That's.
sweet.
It's like you might have known that that's exactly my approach and philosophy, is to combine the best of modern medicine, whether it's bioregulators, peptides, nootropics, with the time-tested preventative medicine strategies from TCM, from the Hermetic principles, from Ayurveda, from all these old systems that really were the original prevention-based medicines.
Yeah.
Well, look
I'm
at that.
with you.
That
That's
was
awesome.
a great one, Will. Thank you for joining me today on the podcast. Are there any final takeaways or conclusions you'd like to leave listeners with?
A really cool hack for you, your listeners. So the front end of flow state, one of the signatures is called transient hypofrontality, which means like a temporary blood flow loss in the prefrontal cortex. One way to trigger that is called exercise-induced transient hypofrontality. And so if you do moderate walking or mild exercise for about 15 minutes, then take the CBD, put it in your coffee. I like to add L-theanine to the stack, and then put a little citrus um, in it, or smell it afterwards, but drink it. And then basically you've hacked your way into a flow-like state because you've got the exercise-induced hyperfertility. The caffeine emulates the stress challenge response by elevating our stress hormones temporarily. Then the cannabinoids, the ECS actually mediates all of flow. But then also one of the signatures is an uptick of anandamide, which you get from the CBD, coupled with the dopamine and by the citrus driving the cannabinoids more towards dopamine function. So anyways, it's like a hack into flow that's worth playing with.
Okay, well, I'm going to cut you off there. No more giving away secrets. We need to have a follow-up round to discuss all of this because there's so much, and we're doing a disservice by trying to cover it in the last final seconds of the podcast. So if people are interested in connecting with you and trying your products, how do they find you on the internet and on socials?
Yeah, so all our social handles will be Ojai Energetics. And then our website is www.ojai energetics.com. And then we're going to build you a custom landing page for your followers where we're going to hook them up with an offer that they can't get anywhere else with some great discounts. And we'll send that link over to you.
Nice. I will put that in the show notes. Thanks for doing that. And until next time, I'm Nick Urban here with Will Kleidon signing out from mindbodypeak.com. Have a great week and be an outlier. I hope that this has been helpful for you. If you enjoyed it, subscribe and hit the thumbs up. I love knowing who's in the 1% committed to reaching their full potential. Comment 1% below so that I know who you are. For all the resources and links, meet me on my website at mindbodypeak.com. I appreciate you and look forward to connecting with you. As a reminder, the information depicted in this video is for information purposes only. Please consult your primary healthcare professional before making any lifestyle changes.